Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. So last week I did a video sharing my top 10 palettes in my collection, and this week I wanted to share my bottom 10 palettes in my collection. So before we jump in, I just want to start out by saying that I love my eyeshadow palette collection. They are some of my favorite things that I own, and just because these palettes are in the bottom does not mean that I hate them, does not mean I want to declutter them. These are just, out of the palettes I own, some of my least favorites. And there are definitely different reasons for each of them, but I just kind of wanted to go through, share my thoughts on these palettes, but again, no hate towards any of these palettes. I do think some of them are good, they just aren't my personal favorite. So again, I'm going to go in no particular order with these, but we're going to start out with Wet n Wild. So this is my Wet n Wild Au Naturel palette, and this is the currently oldest palette in my collection. So honestly, my tastes have just kind of changed from when I got this palette. There are a few older palettes within this set, so they just aren't ones that I'm completely reaching for as much nowadays. My makeup preferences have just changed, but it's still a palette that I do want to get some use out of. This is the one palette in my collection that I feel like I am close to feeling like I could declutter, but I still want to hit a few more pans on this palette, get some more use on it. It still is actually a pretty good performing palette. This is several years old, but it still performs pretty nicely, and one of the main reasons that I keep this palette around is for this shade right here. I've talked about this before, but that is one of my favorite shades in my entire collection. Not just in this palette, but out of all the shades I own, I love what that shade looks like. So it's definitely hard for me to get rid of that one, this palette, when that shade is in here. But it's just not completely what I'm reaching for. It's a little not as exciting as some of the other palettes within my collection, so it's just not a completely favorite anymore. Alright, sticking with Wet n Wild, and I do want to say I love Wet n Wild as a brand. They are one of my favorite brands, especially for the drugstore. I think their quality of their products is really good, especially for drugstore products. But this palette is their Not a Basic Peach palette, and again, my makeup preferences have just kind of changed, and I feel like this is going to be a little surprising because this does actually have some fun little pops of color, and if you know me, if you watched last week's video, you know I like having a mix of color and neutral within my palettes. I like having variety, and this one does have a bit of variety within it, but the color story just isn't really my favorite anymore. I have better shades of these same colors, so it's just kind of gone down in use and ranking within my collection. I still do think it is a really nice palette. I believe these 10-pan palettes are still available on their website, if I'm not mistaken, and I have this one and two others of this 10-pan style, and I really do enjoy them, but this one just isn't my absolute favorite anymore. I feel like this one goes up and down in my ranking depending on the day, but I did feel like I should include it in my bottom 10. Alright, next up we have a newer palette in my collection. So this is the Sweet Pinks by Juvia's Place, and I got this one as a gift, and quite honestly, I'm just not someone reaching for monochromatic palettes. That is pretty much the only reason this one is down at the bottom of my list. I think the quality of it is really nice. I do think it is fun when I want to reach for pinks, but since that is pretty much the only thing you can do with this palette, it's just not one I'm getting a ton of use out of. So again, really good palette. If you are someone who loves pinks, wears pinks on a daily basis, I would probably recommend this palette, but that is just not personally my makeup style, my makeup preference. again, I like variety. And then another new palette, I think this one might actually be the newest palette within my collection. I kind of impulsively bought this palette. This is from Clarity Cosmetics, and they were having one of their scavenger hunt sales, so this palette was free. All I had to do was pay for shipping, and I really wanted to try one of their palettes, so I ended up purchasing this one. So this is the Evil Mermaid. I think the packaging is super cool, and then the color story here is quite pretty. My palette is a little bit messy, destroyed. It came a little broken, and as you can see, there's glitter kind of all over this, and the shade is like coming out. But I touched that barely twice, and that is the pigmentation. So this palette has amazing quality, amazing pigmentation. I think the performance of it is absolutely beautiful. What I do not like is how messy it is. Again, as you can see, this palette is very messy, and I just opened this up for the first time in a little while. Like, I haven't really been touching this palette, and it has kind of exploded with glitter. So it's just a palette that I don't really want to reach for because I know it's going to be super messy. There's a lot of fallout on my face when I use it. I think the mattes are not the best quality. Again, the shimmers are really the star of this palette, but that is the messiest part of this, so honestly, just not my favorite for that reason. So next up is another older palette within my collection. This is my Profusion Mixed Metals Peach palette, and again, similar to the other older palettes within my collection, my makeup preferences have just changed from when I bought this palette. I still think it's really cute. It's a really nice, more neutral color story, but it's not something I'm reaching for on a daily basis. There are definitely times when I am in the mood for this color story and to use this palette, so that is why I still keep it around, because I feel like I would miss it on certain days when I want to reach for it. But on the whole, this is not a palette I'm reaching for a ton, but I do still want to get some more use out of it and hit a few more pans before I end up decluttering it sometime in the future. But again, that is not going to be happening anytime soon, I don't think. And yeah, this palette, this color story isn't the most exciting to me anymore, and I was super excited when I bought it. I thought it was so pretty, and it's still a pretty color story. It's just not one that I'm reaching for a ton anymore. Alright, next up is my Hot Topic Pokemon palette. So I really love the theming of this palette. I was a huge Pokemon fan when I was younger. I had the cards, I had the games. It was a very big part of my childhood, so that is kind of the reason that I really like this palette. I think the color story is super cute as well, but there's just something about this palette that has me not reaching for it, and I don't really know if I could tell you what that is. This is just a palette that I forget about, I definitely neglect. It's definitely a problem, because when I look at it, I'm like, oh, that's a super cute color story, but it doesn't really inspire me to reach for it. So that is something I feel like I need to kind of push myself to overcome a little bit and try and pull this out on a more daily basis, see what kind of use I can get out of it. I feel like this is a really pretty color story for summer. Especially a few years ago, I was super into oranges and blues for the summertime especially. I love that color combo, and this obviously has that color combo, so I really want to try and get some more use out of it. It is just one that, quite honestly, I forget about. Alright, next up we have my I Heart Revolution and Disney Mulan palette. So with this palette, the color story is just a bit confusing to me. I don't really know what looks to create when I look into this palette, and it just throws me off a little bit. I feel like that is not really a problem I have with any of my other palettes. I am usually able to look into a palette and see the looks that I want to create, but with this palette, there is just something about it that the color story just doesn't really make sense in my mind, and I can't automatically come up with color stories for eye looks with this one. With that being said, I have created some gorgeous eye looks with this palette. Pretty much whenever I do reach into this palette, I really like how the look comes out, but there is something just about the color story that I'm not a huge fan of. The quality of this one also is not the best. I'm pretty used to iHeart Revolution quality, and it can be very hit or miss. There are definitely shades in here that are really nice. There are also shades that maybe don't perform the best, but that's really not a big turnoff for me with this palette, just because, again, I am used to that. I have the entire Princess collection from iHeart Revolution, so I've gotten pretty used to having a more hit or miss formula with this. Mostly it's just kind of a color story thing with this one. Next up we have my Delancey Panda palette, and the only reason this one is ranking so low is just because it is a monochromatic gray color story, but that is also the reason I bought this palette. I had felt like I was really lacking in grays, and they are not something I am reaching for on a daily basis by any means, but I really wanted to have a palette that had some nice gray colors in it, so when I was in the mood for it, I could easily reach for this palette and throw the shades on my eyes. So for that reason, the reason I bought it, I think this palette is great. The quality is really nice. I have had no issues with it. It's just not a color story I'm going to be reaching for on a daily basis. I knew that going into it, so there is really nothing against this palette. It just isn't one I'm reaching for a ton. Alright, we are getting into the last couple palettes for this video, and these last two are kind of on the higher end of these bottom 10, so they're kind of palettes I put into this video just because I felt like they ranked below the other palettes in my collection, but I do still really like these ones. So this first one up here is my Bella Cosmetics Sweet Sunflower palette, and here's what this one looks like. And as you can probably guess, the reason I might rank this one lower is just because it is a little bit more monochromatic and doesn't have a ton of variety within it. With that said, I do love yellow eyeshadow, so I think this is a fun one to reach into. I enjoy the mattes in here a lot more than the shimmers. I think the shimmer quality is super nice, but the actual colors of them are not my favorite. I am not a fan of yellow gold eyeshadows. That is just something that has been the case since I started doing my makeup. Yellow golds are just not something I am reaching for, and there are two of them within this palette that look fairly similar, so just having those two being two of the shimmers, two of the 5 shimmers within this palette, just is not a favorite thing of mine. So that is kind of the reason this one is ranking lower. I think the quality, again, is super nice. This is, I believe, a $12 eyeshadow palette. I think I paid $12 for this, so definitely more on the affordable end in my opinion. So quality of this is super nice, especially for that price point. The color story just isn't my favorite, but this is part of a collection, and I do own the entire collection, and being kind of a collector, I am probably not going to ever get rid of this one unless I decide to declutter the entire collection, which isn't going to happen because some of them are some of my favorites within my collection. Alright, then the last palette I want to talk about is the Sigma Untamed palette. So here is what this one looks like, and I will be honest, I think the reason this one ranks so low is just because I was slightly disappointed in it. I was super into this palette before I picked it up. I picked this up as a bundle on, I think, a Black Friday one year, And so I got this one and 2 other palettes, and honestly, when I got this palette, it just was a little underwhelming. It wasn't exactly the type of color story I was wanting to reach for. It's a little bit darker, and just something about it just isn't my favorite. I still think it is a nice palette, and when I reach into it, I do create some really nice looks. The color story is just not an absolute favorite of mine, and I should have definitely known that going in. It looks exactly like the pictures. I just definitely thought I was going to like it more than I did, but I still think the quality is pretty nice. The shades perform well. The color story just really is not a favorite of mine. So those are the 10 palettes that are ranking towards the bottom of my collection. Let me know what you guys thought of this video. Again, I do just want to say that I do love all of the palettes that I own, and I am not planning on decluttering any of them anytime soon, but just for ranking purposes, these were kind of the bottom 10. Give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future uploads. And with all of that said, I will see you in my next video. Bye!